for Australia acknowledges the ongoing effects caused by colonisation. We pay our sincere respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal. Attendees, please be advised that tonight's panel will contain some references to sexual assault, harassment and domestic violence. Good evening, folks, and welcome to In Conversation with Women for Australia. My name is Jess Lane and I am the founder of Women for Australia. I'm hosting this event from my home in Brisbane with my two very young children being looked after upstairs. That said, I cannot guarantee that there won't be any toddler tantrums in the next hour and a half, but we'll keep our fingers and toes crossed.
BBC Dad equivalent.
As I said to my group this week, the juggle is very, very real. And with all things online, we are at the mercy of the technology gods and our internet connection. So if our connection fails, we can just roll our eyes collectively, shrug, and quietly curse Tony Abbott's 2013 NBN policy. Now, our panel tonight is entitled Independence and Gender Equity, and we are so proud to host some of the biggest names of the independence movement that's spreading all over the country. Many of these independent candidates will be campaigning for meaningful action on climate, government integrity and accountability, and our topic tonight, which is gender inequality. Now, any woman or suitably engaged ally who lives or has lived in Australia knows that we have a significant issue with gender inequality. It is both cultural and systemic, and thankfully, gender equality is finally on the agenda this election. But 2021 has been a particularly significant year in this area. Whilst it was the year that gave us Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, Kate Thornton, Christine Holgate, Rochelle Miller, March for Justice, and Sam Mostyn's inspiring recent address at the National Press Club, 2021 was also the year of the so-called Women's Budget, Scott Morrison's Women's Task Force, Kate Jenkins' damning and shameful report into the toxic culture of our federal parliament, and let's never forget that milkshake consent video. Mm-hmm. Both major parties are still falling terribly short on women's policy ambitions, and that's why we're all here tonight. So a little bit about us. Women for Australia started as a Facebook discussion group in March this year, around the time of the women's marches. We wanted to start a civil and solutions-focused conversation about women's policy shortfalls in Australia and how the right policy ambitions could absolutely transform our lives for the better. We felt that there were other women and allies out there that felt exactly the same desire for change that we did and wanted to talk about it. And we were right. 7 months later, our group has over 6,000 members with nearly 4,000 on Twitter, and we are growing every day. So in hosting this event tonight, Women for Australia is evolving while still staying true to its original intention, which is to create change through establishing meaningful connections with others. That is how you change hearts, minds, and ultimately votes. So folks, I'm so excited to speak with this incredible panel of women tonight. Our panel is merely a sample of the groundswell of talent that is coming out of the independence movement every single day, which is so exciting. And with the state of federal politics being what it is, Australians are looking for strong alternatives to the two-party system, which has long been criticised for representing the vested interests of a few rather than the best interests of the voting public. Now, the Voices for or Voices of movement was born out of the Indi model when the legendary Cathy McGowan and the Voices for Indi decided to do politics their own way. And in doing so, they made history. In electing Cathy and unseating a long-serving LNP incumbent, the community of Indi sent a clear message to Canberra, and that is to never take your safe seats for granted. And judging by the tone of the Twitter commentary that I've read in recent weeks, the major parties are spooked, and they should be. So, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for tonight. First, meet the independent candidate for the seat of Goldstein in Victoria, Zoe Daniel. Zoe Daniel grew up in Tasmania and began her career in journalism as a radio producer in South Australia. When she reported on rural issues in New South Wales, Tasmania and Victoria before becoming a business reporter and then a general reporter, working across the spectrum of ABC News and current affairs programs. Zoe has spent almost 3 decades on the front line of news and current events in Australia and internationally, living and working in some of the most challenging environments in the world. She translated the election of Donald Trump for Australians and has brought insights from Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Americas home, illuminating key global events. Zoe is a 3-time foreign correspondent and former ABC United States bureau chief. She has met and interviewed displaced people, refugees, soldiers, voters, business people, women and children and families, prime ministers and presidents. Zoe's new book, Greetings from Trumpland, which sounds awesome, by the way, with colleague Roscoe Whalen, was released in March 2021. And Zoe currently lives in Melbourne with her husband, Rowan, and children, Archie and Pearl, and golden retriever, Tully. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you.
Next, we have Professor Kim Rubenstein. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
An independent candidate for the ACT Senate. Professor Kim Rubenstein is a distinguished law professor and an expert on how government should be run to serve the best interests of the community. She frequently acts pro bono in citizenship cases for the High Court of Australia, the Federal Court, and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and has always defended the values of liberal democracy. Kim is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law and the Australia Academy of Social Sciences, and announced with over 1,800 members the formation of the Kim for Canberra party in order to run as an independent above the line on the Senate ballot paper. Amazing. Her party's registration, the Australian Electoral Commission, is almost complete. In 2013, Kim also won the Edna Ryan Award for Leadership for her tireless work as a gender equity advocate and is the co-director of the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation at the University of Canberra. Huge welcome to you, Kim.
Thanks so much, Jess.
Our third panellist is Zoe Dyer, the recently announced independent candidate for the outgoing incumbent Nicole Flint's seat of Boothby in South Australia. A graduate of the University of Adelaide in Law and Politics, Jo is currently the director of the Adelaide Writers Festival Week and will present her final festival in March 2022. She's previously held leadership roles at the national cultural institutions, including Sydney Theatre Company, the Come Out Festival, which is now called Dream Big Festival, and Bangarra Dance Theatre. Jo's first book, Burning Down the House, Reconstructing Contemporary Politics, which also sounds amazing, by the way, will be published in February 2022 by Monash University Publishing. In 2021, Jo was thrust unexpectedly into the national spotlight when she became an advocate for her deceased friend Kate, after Kate's accusation of sexual assault against then Attorney General and now outgoing member for Pierce, Christian Porter, were made posthumously public. I recently tweeted that if they ever redefine the word friendship, I hope they use a picture of Jo Dyer. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you.
Now, if you've been feeling annoyed by all the text messages you've been receiving lately from the United Australia Party, our next panellist is here to put a stop to them. Meet Georgia Steele. Georgia practiced as a corporate and commercial litigator for 15 years across 4 continents, including for the Big Four Bank in Australia. She lives with her husband and 2 children in Como in the federal electorate of Hughes, where she is running as a community-endorsed independent candidate for the next federal election against ex-Liberal Party, now UAP leader, Craig Kelly. Georgia is running on platforms of urgent action on climate, enhancing federal integrity measures, equality and small business recovery. She's standing for Parliament because she just could not sit by any longer. So big welcome to you, Georgia.
Thanks, Jess.
Thank you. Now, the format for tonight will be quite simple. I have a range of pre-planned questions that we have, I've either written myself or collected from the Women for Australia Facebook group, which has got a lot of really interested people tonight. Our panellists have received prior warning to the topics of the pre-arranged questions, but not of the exact wording of the questions themselves. We ask that panellists try to keep their responses to the pre-arranged questions to around a minute each. We'll see how we go. There's a lot to get through. While certain questions, depending on the topic, may be directed at 1 or 2 panellists in particular, I will give other panellists some time to contribute to the same question should they choose to. Throughout the evening, members of the wonderful Women for Australia mods team will text me questions from the audience as they come through. These questions will be completely unseen, both by myself and panellists, and it'll be a great practice for the campaign trail. The video recording will be saved and posted to all our platforms, and we encourage our panellists and indeed our listeners and viewers to share it on their platforms too. The audio from this recording will also be available as a podcast episode of the same name, In Conversation with Women for Australia. Finally, I wanted to mention that Women for Australia is running a fundraising initiative all its own to help campaigns with strong plans to address gender inequality. If you like what we're doing please visit our website, which is www.womenforaustralia.com.au, and donate today. We're completely grassroots, so every little bit helps. All right, shall we begin the questions? Fantastic. All right, question 1. My first question tonight is about the independent movement as a whole. There have been a number of scare campaigns this week, both online and through social media, about the so-called hidden agendas of independent candidates. Independents have been called, and I quote, frauds, or covert Labor and Greens candidates, or hypocrites, among other things. And now apparently they have a problem with you having money as well. So my question is, what do you say to voters who, despite their disillusionment with the major parties, may still have reservations about voting for an independent? Jo, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'd just simply ask them why. What's their reservation? I mean, we've all heard for so long that people are sick of both of the major parties, the kind of plague on both your houses sort of rhetoric, which has really been very prevalent in our community for some time. But if people want things to be done differently, they have to vote differently. And it seems to me that we've had a really fine example of what independents can do, and good role models, people like Cathy McGowan, Helen Haynes, Karen Phelps when she was there, Andrew Wilkie's been, down in Tasmania for a long time. And what these people have shown is that you can get elected, and then you can stand up for what you believe. I don't think any of the people that I've seen, read about, started to meet who are running for Parliament at the next election are naive about politics. We're quite clear-eyed that it can require the art of the compromise and that you may have to negotiate. But I think what we're all saying is that there are some issues which are urgent, which have been ignored for too long now. We're facing an emergency, particularly around climate and against violence against women. And that you can get into Parliament and voice these views strongly, with integrity, and you can make a difference. Now, if more independents are elected, and if there is a crossbench that holds the balance of power, we'll be in such a strong and powerful position to really make the change that everybody is saying that they want. Coalitions are not unusual things in parliaments all around the world. Stable governments run in coalitions, sometimes formalised, sometimes, like in Canada, more just alliances. Despite Tony Abbott's rhetoric, Julia Gillard's minority government was the most productive in decades. Absolutely. So I'm not sure what the fear is, and if people genuinely want to affect change, then now is the time to open up your mind and imagine something different, because there does seem to be a movement that is developed quite organically, whatever the major parties and News Corp are saying. It has developed organically, and it is there to provide a different way and a new way. And I say, and I watched it happen and have joined it as a result of it. Maybe because I was waiting for there to be safety in numbers. But I think now is the moment, this election where so much is at stake, there is a viable third option here. So I say, don't be afraid. Give us your vote and get out there and persuade others to do exactly the same.
Thank you, Jo. And what about you, Kim?
So I think there are a couple of things. First of all, it's not new to have independents putting up their hand. And in fact, the wonderful Claire wrote a wonderful piece recently about Vida Goldstein, whose seat Zoe is seeking to represent, of a woman who saw very early on that the party political structure was set up by men and had very unattractive aspects to it. Now, that's not to say there might be some value in parties in any democracy, but I think we've come to the point in Australia where we see the parties as being real hurdles to good and meaningful policy change. I mean, the urgent issues of our time, such as climate change, are the exemplar of an area in which the parties have become the hurdles and the problem in developing meaningful change. And I've been saying, and I really believe this as someone who has been a sort of commentator seeking to provide expert opinion and critiquing both sides of government and being able to continue that as a candidate, as an independent, that I actually think we're at the point where independents are going to be bringing out the best in terms of the potential for changed political discourse, in being able to engage with the ideas and not the parties or the people, but the person, but the issues. But I also think it's an opportunity to actually improve the parties. I think we all know that there's some really great politicians out there who are caught within their party structures and are unable to progress really important policy changes because of the legacies of those parties, which have become caught in those frameworks of factions and power shares. Yeah. And so I think that this movement is actually going to improve not only the way in which we do politics generally, but it's going to be a move to change and improve our parties. And I think that's really significant.
I'm cautiously hopeful. Kim, what about you, Georgia?
Oh, look, I agree with everything that Joe and Kim have said. You mentioned in your introduction, Jess, that we've been accused of having hidden agendas. In relation to that, I would just say that our agendas aren't hidden just because the Liberal National Coalition can't find them. These issues are urgent, they are imperative, and I think that the reason that the independent women have popped up in the places that they have popped up is because our government is failing to address these issues. What I would add to what Joe and Kim have said is that one of the things that I'm really keen to see as a consequence of more independents getting elected is federal politics being brought back down to a community level. I think that what we're missing in federal politics at the moment are representatives who actually genuinely represent their communities and act in the interests of their individual communities. That's how our electoral system is supposed to operate. That's why we have members of the House of Representatives representing communities of around the same size all across the country. And I think that the party system has forgotten that and abandoned the people in their own electorates. What independents will have to do is work incredibly hard for the people on the ground. They will have to vote in a way that guarantees the interests of their electorate are being looked after, not the interests of their party, not the interests of their donors, not the interests of any lobbyists. So let's try and make federal politics local again with an increase in the number of independents in Parliament.
Well, I think we're on the right track there, Georgia. Zoe.
I think it's a question of, are you happy with the status quo or not? And if you're happy with the status quo, continue voting the way that you've always been voting. And I'm in a blue ribbon Liberal seat here in Goldstein, where really there's not much point in voting. The only point in voting is to not get fined. We don't have a voice in the Parliament. We don't have a voice in the party room. We have a so-called moderate Liberal MP who votes with the National Party every single time. So it's not representative of the views and priorities of people in the electorate. And in the last few weeks since we launched our campaign, just speaking to people on the street, in the shopping centres, people who stop at the front gate, the overarching issue is accountability. That's what people want back. And unfortunately, the party system is not delivering that, because everything about the party system is about winning and getting re-elected and how policies will play with people, rather than actually how they will affect communities and how they will benefit us as a society. So I think I could say that none of us would be sitting here if we didn't think it was needed. It would be a lot easier not to step in to the fray. And for someone like me, who's been around politics for a long time, who's been in the room, who's seen how challenging it can be, it would have been much easier to stay out of it. But there comes a point where you actually have to step in to try to create a voice for people to bring about the change that we want to see.
Absolutely. I might skip question 2 and come back to it if we have time, because I am conscious of time. I'm going to skip straight to the elephant in the room, which is diversity. Whilst it's wonderful to see such a large portion of candidates from the Voices for movement being women, and any step towards 50-50 representation is a good thing. However, I think we need to talk about the lack of diversity that we are seeing in the candidates that are coming out, community endorsed candidates that we're seeing at the moment. So my question to the panel is, when elected, how will you ensure that the legislation that you support and or develop will also benefit individuals and groups that are not well represented in our parliament? And I guess we'll start with Georgia this time.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, it's something that has been coming up a little bit, this concept of the lack of diversity amongst the independent women who are stepping forward. I, for one, think that that's a really important conversation to be having. Most of certainly women, the vast majority of the independents stepping forward are women who have backgrounds like me. And I firmly believe that our parliament should reflect the country that we have in all its diversity. I think it's a great thing that one of the consequences of the women stepping forward is that we might get a high number of women in the House of Representatives, which is critical. We've only got 31% of women in there now, and that will be a good outcome. Having said that, I also don't think it's enough to leave it with, well, you know, we'll pave the way and we'll get more women there and then others can follow. I don't think that's sufficient. And I think that the debate really needs to be around what we can do now, how much more we can do. And as an independent, I think you have a level of freedom in the way that you approach who is going to be stepping forward for Parliament. And there's a long time until the election. I would encourage people of all different backgrounds, of all different communities, and any people who feel that they're in a minority to step forward and think about running for Parliament. As to how to ensure that legislation that I have to look at will properly take into account the needs and considerations of diverse groups of people, I think we'll cover this a little bit perhaps in a later question, but I would be interested in the introduction of some kind of human rights legislation. And I think that the impact of that kind of legislation would be that these kinds of issues that we're talking about, making sure that there's high levels of equality, high levels of fairness, more equality of opportunity in our society would be forced to be reckoned with at the point of looking at the legislation that we're going to need to look at in Parliament. So that's one way that I would hope to progress those issues.
Fantastic. And Zoe, what about you?
I think, I've asked myself this question over the last couple of weeks. Why am I sitting here? And in part, it's because I'm a white person who's had opportunities and I haven't faced the roadblocks that people of colour face. Yes, women face roadblocks, but that's very different to the sorts of roadblocks that are placed in the way of people of different cultural backgrounds. So as someone who's very aware of that, who's worked in a lot of different cultural settings, that is something that I can advocate for once I'm elected, to get in and try to change things from the inside. And I do think that, there are various avenues that we could consider around diversity quotas that encompass more than gender, and that's something for down the track. But I think that every piece of legislation, every policy needs to be considered through the lens of how does this affect people of different cultural backgrounds? How does it affect someone who is different to me? And as someone who's spent a long time in journalism trying to look at problems through different sides of the prism and speaking to people from very different backgrounds from me, I feel that that's going to be a big focus to try to consider, well, how does it affect someone differently to how it affects me? And I think that should be inbuilt into our system when we're considering policy. And that has to be done in direct consultation with people from different cultural settings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And Jo?
Well, I think Zoe's sort of hit the nail on the head with particularly the last part of her answer there, where she talked about direct consultation, really. And when we think about the Uluru Statement, that is all about First Nations people having a direct voice to Parliament and a structurally embedded voice to Parliament. And I think that it is structural change that is required in that way. So that would be an important first step for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And then perhaps once we've got that, we can extrapolate that more broadly, not in a constitutional way, because obviously First Nations peoples occupy a particularly special place in our country and thus should in the Constitution, but actually having people who are going to be directly affected by legislation and who have lived experience of the kind of issues which are being discussed and drafted and will be affected by legislation. I mean, these are the sorts of things that we need to have as a matter of course. I think it is interesting, and I was reflecting on the issue as well about why it's all white women, and I know the Daily Telegraph said today it's not just all white women, it's white women of a particular class as well. And class is an important consideration here, I think, because independents, we're doing this all under our own steam. And sure, Climate 200 may well be contributing, and some people are well networked or have the voices of, quite well resourced, but that's not the case everywhere. And it's certainly not the case. The Voices of Boothby is a genuine, I'm not trying to say others aren't, but it's not a well-resourced or well-networked organisation particularly. So people who are saying, I'm going to take time out from my life and potentially my job, I'm going to try and fundraise or underwrite my own campaign to a greater degree, there's only a very small number of people who can afford to do that. And some of us are potentially doing it when we can't quite afford to do it. So for those who don't come from a relatively privileged class background as well, there are considerations quite before you even consider then sort of active discrimination for people of colour. So I think, class is a particular issue that I think we often don't speak about much in Australia, but I'm keen to articulate views on. And as I say, I think legislatively to make sure that there is a formal and embedded and structural way that people who are affected by any piece of legislation can be consulted and are consulted as a matter of course.
Sounds like we might have to have you back, Jo. And Kim Rubenstein.
Oh. Look, so I think that all of these sentiments reflect a mix of our own acknowledgement of privilege and belief in using that to better our country as a whole. And so weaving that into everything that we do, I think that's just so fundamental to the impetus for each of us, and certainly for me, for wanting to run and choosing now to do so. But there are also other structural issues. I agree with Jo that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is the first step in terms of constitutional change. And I feel that, and quite excited about the potential of my role in the Senate, if elected, to be able to be a real catalyst for that. But there is another constitutional change that could help with cultural diversity. And that is, of course, Section 44(1) of the Constitution. 49% of people in Australia are either born outside of the country or their parents are born outside of the country.
Very interesting.
That means that all of those people have access to another citizenship that they have to renounce before in order to nominate, to run. So no guarantee of winning, and to renounce that other citizenship. That is a profound hurdle. And I think the issue at stake here is that anyone who is wanting to nominate is showing a commitment to run for Parliament, to contribute to Australia. And I've always seen citizenship a little in terms of that sense of allegiance and the concern about someone holding another citizenship to be more like parenthood. We all know if we have more than one child that we're not losing our allegiance to any of those children. And I think in a similar way, in a multicultural society, in a globalized world, that there are better ways for dealing with potential conflicts when you have another citizenship. And if we were to move forward after a successful Uluru Statement to the Heart constitutional change and show people we can actually do constitutional change, that would be a way of directly addressing the lack of diversity of culture in multicultural Australia. And I think that is something that we should all take on board. And we can see in recent discussions, the whole closing of the borders in Australia, there's no question that we needed to protect the health of Australians inside of Australia, but there were better ways of protecting the health of those stranded Australian citizens. And if we'd had more multicultural society reflected in our parliament, all those people who have been prevented from seeing their family for a couple of years based here because they couldn't travel out, let alone travelling back in, and those Australians outside who couldn't come back to see their family, who they are deeply connected to in our globalised world. If we'd had more members of our parliament who were experiencing that themselves, we would have seen a completely different approach that was health protective at the same time. And I think that if we make those structural changes, we're on the road to better representation.
Yeah, and better structural changes leads to cultural change. Absolutely. All right, question 4, panel. This is a bit of a speech because it's a bit of a policy passion in my group. So the next topic is about the care economy and the unpaid workforce, as we like to call it. Unpaid care in Australia is worth $650 billion annually. That's every year to Australia's GDP. That is a monumental amount of invisible labour that is disproportionately undertaken by women. This includes stay-at-home parent care, grandparent care, caring for elderly relatives, caring for family members with disabilities. Now, every day, carers in Australia sacrifice a career in the paid workforce to care for their loved ones. This sacrifice is then rewarded with little to no superannuation and the very real prospect of a retirement in poverty. This is not okay. And if I sound passionate about this, it's because I am. So my question to the panel is, as independents, what will you do to put the care economy on the government's agenda so that Australia can finally start properly valuing unpaid domestic labour? I think we'll start with Zoe this time.
So I was recently involved in some research work on the care economy, particularly in regard to retail workers. And I spent a lot of time, a couple of months, actually calling and speaking to retail workers about their experience of work and care. And it was an absolute revelation to me as a middle-class person, just how challenging life can be for what in many cases are our working poor, and the load particularly on women. And the sort of multi-edged impact of caring for children, working, caring for elderly relatives, potentially caring for family members with special needs, cascading impact on your own health, sometimes bridging into substance abuse, but also your own health issues and general stress. There were women that I spoke to who were getting up at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, going to their job, working a shift until midday, driving to their elderly parents' house, doing their washing, cleaning their house, doing their groceries, feeding them dinner, taking them to medical appointments, going home, feeding their own children, cleaning their own houses, going to bed and starting it all again the next day. The impact of this is vast on our community, and there's a lot happening internationally on revaluation of the care economy and just what contribution those women are making to GDP, the impact on productivity that has, but also how alleviating those pressures could actually increase our economic strength and also take the pressure off those women to give them more opportunities to actively participate in the workforce and have quality of life. So, there's a lot to unpack there, Jess, but it's a real passion project for me as well. And I actually think it's also part of the conversation that we've been having about women's safety in the workplace, general attitudes towards gender, how women are treated, how women are valued, the contribution, our place in society. This is all interlinked. And I think we need to actually sit down and have a summit and bring all the experts together and figure out what we can do in structural ways to revalue the contribution of women, take pressure off women, provide adequate childcare for people on shifts, and there's all sorts of pieces there that will benefit our community in so many ways, economically, socially. There's 1,000 impacts and it has to happen.
Absolutely. And it is a lot, but you're absolutely right. We need to be having these conversations, which is, I think, is a really good step in the right direction tonight. Jo, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I would agree. I guess I would just add two things, which are related to what Zoe's been talking about. I mean, it is the kind of precarity of our workforce, I think, which is problematic as well. The stagnation of wages, the casualisation of the workforce, the really insecure jobs that people are forced to get when they're working around so many different other commitments. And so they are not able to engage fully in the workforce, but they need to earn something of a living. And so they're forced to, work in marginal ways where they're vulnerable to exploitation, and the pay's poor anyway because of the gendered nature of our pay and the stagnation of our pay in real terms over such a long period of time. So I think, the decline of the union movement, I think, has played a role in all of this as well. And so I'd like to kind of get back in and do what we can to help strengthen the union movement and the way that they have been a stalwart when it comes to advocating for better pay and conditions for those people who are juggling to such a large degree. But on the flip side, I would also say that a different approach and attitude towards our social welfare system would help a lot of these women a lot too, where they didn't have to go out and break their backs because they were actually provided with meaningful income from the state, which is there to support them to recognise the contribution that they are making to the care economy. And if we didn't have a kind of punitive and draconian attitude when we're trying to develop the best way of providing income support for people in genuine need, I think that would really help too.
Not to mention how it would alleviate the pressure on the systems that already exist that provide that care from the state.
Absolutely. Mutual obligation is a term which is thrown around, but I don't really understand what that means when all it is trying to do is to make people engage in sort of bureaucratic hoop jumping that takes them away then from living their lives productively or providing the support and care that they need to for their families. So I think there's a wholesale review that needs to go on in the way that our social security system is structured. We see the attitude which is taking to hollowing out the still nascent NDIS. Instead of trying to fix problems within the service delivery, is that they're trying to kick people off the service. And you see the minister saying it's not supposed to be social welfare system for life. Actually, yes, it is. That's what the NDIS system was created.
That is exactly what it is by design.
Continuity of care, security of care. All of these things, I think, they're all interrelated because it does speak to an attitude. And, I think particularly this government that we've seen over the last few years, but generally an attitude about the way that we approach the vulnerable, the different, the marginalised, and how we've gone from trying to create a living wage as every Australian's right to really kind of duking it out and making it much more kind of Hunger Games approach. And I think these things really do compound the challenges that particularly women have when they're juggling all of these balls.
And I tell you what, that's how I'll be voting, is for candidates who have plans for the care economy and to really, really hold the government to account for those things. Thank you, Jo. Kim, your turn.
I think that COVID really amplified how fundamental the care economy is to the survival of a nation. I mean, one of the first dramatic policy announcements was that childcare would be universal in order to enable the workers to be able to support the country. That is a statement of the very basic fact of everyday life for most families, that childcare is fundamental in order for us to sustain the nation. And so once we accept that, it is about saying we need to think through how that plays out beyond COVID, because it is fundamental to a healthy society.
Actually, I heard a good saying recently that said that care is infrastructure.
Well, that's right.
It's so true. It's so true.
That it is a funder. We need our roads, but we also need the caring industries as fundamental to the health and well-being of a nation. And some of the work that we've been doing at the 50/50 Foundation has been amplifying that if we're really wanting to encourage the equality of women in leadership, we actually have to address the caring aspects of all of our lives, because unless what is happening in the home is about equality in the home, how do you get to then equality in the public sphere? So one of the things that I think is really important to advocate is that in order for us to have true equality in society, we've got to be sharing the caring. And what that means is that it shouldn't just be the load of women for caring in society. We need to normalise that this is something that all human beings should be responsible for.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I'd be advocating is for a much greater attention to parental leave provisions that have the expectation that both partners are involved right from the start. And I think that that would not only normalise caring as being fundamental to our society and to all human beings, but it would also be such a boost to gender equity in such profound ways. Children seeing in their homes equality within the home and expectation then of equality outside of the home. And then what beyond the parental leave for those early years, the expectation of the sharing of the load of childcare, not only within the home, but as a state, that we have a responsibility, as the state showed in that time of crisis, for childcare, and childcare that provides good quality childcare so that our children are being looked after right from the start, not only through their parents, but through a state that commits to high quality childcare. So I'd say parental leave and childcare are the areas that I'm going to be committed to in the Senate in working towards to really bolster a healthy society.
The only thing that disappoints me about that, Kim, is that you're not running in Queensland.
Have an impact in Queensland. The Senate could be really key in that overall effect. So thanks, Jess.
Excellent, excellent. Well, and finally we have Georgia.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I was actually going to mention both childcare and parental leave as absolutely critical to women's equality in all areas of life, both in unpaid labour, invisible labour, in the care economy generally. I have personally experienced what it's like to be the person who doesn't take the majority of parental leave in a household. My children are 8 and 9 years old, and I was still practicing law when I had them. I took an amount of time off, and then my husband stopped working and looked after our children for several years, probably, all up around 5 years until the kids were off at school. And that was absolutely wonderful. That was an economic decision for us. It's a decision that most families don't get to make in any kind of objective or calm manner. And I suppose in saying that, I'm acknowledging my privilege here as well. But it made a huge difference in our household. And I think it's made an impact on our children over the years, seeing the properly shared split between my husband and I. I just wanted to, in relation to this topic in particular, just throw a couple of statistics out there which are quite alarming in relation to the care economy in particular. Now, Australia has slipped a dramatic number of places in the Global Gender Gap Report since it was first published in 2006. We were number 15 in 2006 when it was first published, and last year we were number 50, 35 places behind where we started. We slipped 6 places last year alone, and the 6 places that we slipped last year alone were as a result of the disproportionate impact that COVID had on women in Australia. And a lot of that is because of the unpaid care and invisible labour that women were asked to take on in a disproportionate way to what men were asked to take on. And that is also, a reflection of how society works generally. The other statistic that I wanted to raise, and it's in relation to what I've said just now, is that more than 93% of all primary care leave in Australia is taken by women. 93%. Now that is a drastic figure. Of all the care that's taken in relation to raising children in this country, only 7% of it is taken by men. And I think that has knock-on effects for women across all areas of society, across all different sectors, and for their whole lives. It can lead to poverty in retirement years. It leads to worsening outcomes from a career point of view for the for the entire length of people's career. So I strongly agree with Kim. I would focus on childcare and paternity leave, and just, you know, to throw a controversial opinion out there, let's throw making paternity leave compulsory into the mix, just as a very dramatic way to break that circuit.
Well, my husband and I were talking about the same thing, because he's taken time off work to look after our children, and he has said that it really gave him an understanding of what it requires. And he said, and he does wish that more men would take it, because it would normalize men taking time out of the workforce, the paid workforce, in order to do caring responsibilities. And I think that that's beneficial for everyone.
Absolutely. Could I just add, Jess, before we move on from this, that there's another piece which is about carers leave more broadly, and it's not about necessarily having children. A lot of people need to take time off work, particularly people who are on low incomes, to care for people with special needs who are in their family circle or elderly relatives. And those people are not really catered for. And a lot of our focus, I think, is on middle-class women who need childcare on a sort of 9 till 6 basis, which cuts out not only those people that I'm talking about who need time off to do caring roles for people other than children, but also people on low incomes that Joe referenced, in a very precarious work situation with shifts that are all over the place, who need care for their children out of hours. So there's a lot of structural issues in this that is beyond traditional childcare, and that's the way that we should be looking at this.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you. That was all excellent responses. Thank you so much. We're going to have a very short break from, and I just wanted to let the attendees know that if you have a question that you'd like to pose to the panel for the end of tonight, please post it under the Q&A tab rather than on the chat, because I think some of these messages are getting lost or sort of just getting a little bit muddled, because there are quite a few chats coming through, which is great, and the feedback has been really excellent. But please submit your questions under the Q&A tab. Now, I've got a quick promo for I just want to take a quick break to give a plug to a new organisation that was just brought to my attention today by Susan Benediker, who is a Women for Australia group member, but also an independent Senate candidate for Victoria. Love your work, Susan. Independent Voices for the Senate is a party-like vehicle to support independent senators for election. They still need to reach the newly increased membership threshold. It used to be 500 members, and now it's 1,500 members in order to register for the AEC. So if you care about helping quality community-endorsed independent senators get elected, go to www.independentvoicesforsenate.org. Now that's a number 4, not FOR. That website again is www.independentvoicesforsenate.org. Thank you.
Jess, can I at that point just share with people that distinction for the Senate compared to the House?
Please do. Please do, Kim.
Just for those listening, in terms of the independent movement, as we've seen, it's been largely in the lower house. The difference with the Senate is, of course, the above the line and below the line voting. For the House, of course, you have one ballot paper, and you're an independent and a party member are all on the ballot paper in an equal way, and depending on the lottery of where you land in order, that's the only difference within the ballot paper. But for the Senate, you've got the choice of above the line or below the line. And the reality is that around the country, about 90% of people vote above the line, not below the line.
Both can put their numbers in individually.
You have to be a party. So that is why I made a sort of strategic decision very early on, as someone committed to running as an independent, to put myself on an equal playing field for the voting system by creating the Kim for Canberra party. So I'm not formally part of the Voices movement, but I have the same ethos and approach to the importance of having an independent voice in the Senate. And the Kim for Canberra party was set up in order to bring that independent voice for Canberra and the ACT to the Senate. And as Susan said, there's a high threshold, and in some ways my community engagement was getting those numbers. So I now have almost 2,000 members, which is a wonderful affirmation of the spirit of the need for this. And the Australian Electoral Commission have approved it, and it's now up for public comment for a month. But Susan's call is so that each independent person wanting to run for the Senate doesn't have to set up a party, as I have done, her call was for a sort of a broader party, which is purely to enable Senate candidates who are independent to run above the line. And I think it's a really important sort of democratic issue more broadly. And certainly the Senate, as you all know, is equally significant in the future of our nation, because of course anything that gets passed in the lower house has to be passed in the Senate. And one of the issues that I'll bring to everyone's attention is that no matter who wins the next election, the half Senate election will guarantee that whoever wins will not have the majority in the Senate. And so my role on the crossbench is going to be pretty significant and important for the future direction of policy. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to do too much of a plug, but it is an interesting issue in terms of democratic representation.
Could I quickly ask you what your thoughts were about the change in AEC number registrations?
So I think that was not consistent with healthy democracy in the sense of a desire to make it more difficult for smaller groups to actually be participating in a similar fashion. I mean, I think you do need to have a threshold to show that there is support. And of course, there are consequences, not only in terms of being above the line for the Senate, but also your capacity to claim funds for this, depending on the number of votes that you get. And of course, those regulations are important. So it's not irresponsible to have some preconditions to form a party, but I think that the threefold increase from 500 to 1,500 members did show an overreaction to the needs of those democratic frameworks.
I would quite agree. All right, we're going to move on to question 5 for tonight. The next question ties into the care economy, because homelessness in retirement is another terrifying prospect for far too many women, particularly in our group. A number of Women for Australia members have either experienced periods of homelessness or deeply fear it. The fastest growing group among the homeless is women over the age of 55. And this issue has been made worse by the pandemic, plus insufficient public and social housing, insecure work, which we've touched on, a shortage of accommodation for women and children who are escaping violence, a rental and housing affordability crisis, don't talk to me about house prices, and woefully inadequate government support payments. So my question to the panel is, what is it going to take for the government to start taking housing affordability and homelessness seriously? And how will you use your positions in Parliament to address homelessness, particularly for older women? And I'll start with, I keep forgetting, Jo.
I might jump in because just so everyone knows, and I did warn both Jess and the panelists, I'm not being insanely rude, but I will have to leave in a few minutes because at 8 o'clock Adelaide time, so that's in just over half an hour, I have my first interaction online with the good people of Boothby, which was to be the launch of my candidacy, but then my candidacy got leaked on Monday, so I was scrabbling around. Look, actually, Jess, I think that in your question, you actually had a really great summary of all of the key issues which have contributed to homelessness for older women. I mean, housing affordability is insane. And unless we remove the distortions from the housing market so that we recognise that people actually should be living in homes and not using them as investment vehicles, that's going to be difficult. I think a massive investment in social housing, that was such a lost opportunity during the pandemic when all of this money was being flung around to, focus it on renovations for, second homes rather than actually putting money into the construction of social housing that then could be made available to the lower income cohort in our midst. Just terrible tragedy, given how much money has been spent across that period by government. There are great models everywhere and at different tiers of government that could be followed, but were not. It does, I think, come back to the questions that we were actually talking about earlier in the care economy about why so many women find themselves without superannuation when it comes to their retirement age, because they are the ones who are taking time out of the workforce and so thus do not have consistent income, do tend to be working part-time on lower incomes. All of those issues then feed into a lack of superannuation. And then again, I would come back to the kind of parsimonious nature of our welfare system. Well, pensions not really considered part of the welfare system, but our transfer payments from government, that they're just kept sort of down so low. There's no flexibility as well about people who would like to take on some kind of part-time work before that starts impacting on your income. All of the, again, these sort of structural issues that we keep coming back to that all feed into each other and are interwoven to such a great degree. That's what makes, you know, life so potentially precarious for people, particularly women if they find themselves at the end of a marriage breakup or something. So many, I mean, I always had such anxiety about the notion of not being as financially independent as one can be, and pooling all of one's incomes, which I know doesn't make me particularly great when it comes to intimacy. But the fear is that if, and you have put all your eggs in one basket and relationships break down, then that is a leading contributor for female poverty as well, unexpected relationship breakdown. So I just think there's so many interrelated issues across all of the conversations that we've had tonight, which are not complicated to address. It's a political choice not to address them. Absolutely. And that's why I think an independent crossbench can have such an impact, because for all of the reticence to break open the paradigm of our current policy positions, we can call them to account and we can say, you know, this is what we've been elected to do, and we're going to hold you to account. And we can be a shield behind which the major parties can hide, if you like. Not our fault. They're making us do it. I'm happy to take that on, because that's what we're doing it for. That's what we're doing it for. And on that note, declamatory, I will have to slip away, but it's thank you all for attending. It's lovely to see my fellow independents, and I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other across the campaign.
Oh, and Jo, thank you so much for making the time to be with us tonight.
Not at all.
It's been such a thrill to meet you. I can't even tell you. So best of luck with your campaign.
Thank you.
We'll be watching very closely.
Yeah. See you all.
Jo. All right, let's move on to Kim, your response to the question about homelessness.
Yes, I think that's right. I remember quite distinctly when Liz Broderick first took on the role of Sex Discrimination Commissioner, sitting in a room in Canberra in Civic, listening to her talk about the areas that she was going to highlight. And we're talking a significant period of time ago, because Kate Jenkins has been doing a remarkable and fantastic job in her role as her successor. But Liz did bring up right at the start how, from her listening tour, she'd gone around the whole country, that the question of homelessness for older women was a key issue. So it's not like these ideas are new and that we haven't had great people making significant suggestions about how to deal with this. It's just a matter, as Jo just said, of a will to actually act on them with the, you know, significant amount of advice that it's already out there that we can benefit from and use collectively to make change. But I do think the other aspect of it, which is has been really interesting in all the community engagement that I've been doing since announcing and meeting. Each person who joins has been invited to meet with me and invite up to 20 people to come and share with me some of their concerns here in Canberra, is the accessibility to housing and housing prices more broadly. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you unpack that in terms of women entering the workforce and the gender pay gap, that all of those aspects keep cascading onto the latter point that we're talking about, which is homelessness and the disproportionate position of women in that category. Mm. But I think even just for young people who are entering the workforce and thinking about their own security, men and women, that we need to address the changed hurdle, the growing hurdles for young Australians and for the future of their well-being. So I think that they really are profound issues for all of us at different levels in our lives, but most significantly.
Absolutely. Georgia.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I think that coming to this issue, it's pretty clear that homelessness amongst older women is just emblematic of every other issue that we've been talking about tonight. So all of the gaps that exist in relation to the genders come to a point in a woman's life where they find themselves in much more dire circumstances than what men do. We have, as Kim mentioned, the gender pay gap, which is still at 14% between men and women working in the same industry. There is a gender pay gap at the moment favouring full-time working men over full-time working women in every single occupational and industry category in Australia, every single one. So even if you're a nurse or a teacher, you are still earning less as a woman as what you are as a man. That moves on to, gaps in superannuation as a result of the time that women take out of the workforce for caring responsibilities that we were talking about before. All of these things lead to a point where women are becoming homeless. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned, of course, is that family and domestic violence continues for older women, and that can be a huge cause of homelessness in older generations.
Mm. Are you still with us, Georgia?
So all of the issues do come to a point in which, yep, am I in? Am I back?
Yeah,
okay.
You're just lagging a little bit, that's all.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, even in COVID last year, I already talked about the disproportionate impact that COVID had on women. But one thing that we didn't mention was this concept of the Great Resignation. I know a lot of women who resigned their jobs during COVID because everything just became just that little bit too hard. It was a little bit too difficult to cope. And who were the ones who stepped out of the workforce first? It was women. Mm. Now, all of these things lead to less security, less economic security in later life. So again, it's these structural systemic problems, all of which lead to this point, and all of which need to be looked at in a very holistic way.
And they can be addressed. We just need a strong crossbench that has the political will to do it. And Zoe.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things have been addressed, but superannuation is a key piece, and also superannuation being paid on parental leave is a huge factor. Women end up behind innately as soon as they take time off to have children or then go part-time. So that's something that needs to be addressed. But I think there are, and it's interesting, affordable housing is something that has been coming up a lot as I have been meeting people over the last few weeks. And Goldstein is a very wealthy electorate. And even with that, this is a very central concern for a lot of people. Younger people who are obviously concerned about getting into the housing market, parents who are concerned about their children being able to get into the housing market, and then older people who perhaps don't have enough to support themselves in retirement and then are looking at astronomical rents. I think we can afford to be, and we should try to be a bit more innovative on this, rather than just saying, oh, this is an intractable problem, house prices are sky high, we can't do anything about it. We're seeing institutional investors, superannuation companies, for example, putting a lot of money into quite innovative affordable housing projects. For example, charging rent at 85% of the market rate to enable people, for example, medical workers, to work near the hospitals that they work in, which also has an environmental impact, because if they're close to public transport, they don't have to drive, they don't have to park. So there's lots of flow-on effects. You're seeing those companies putting billions of dollars into affordable housing in places like California. That money should be going into projects in Australia. And I think there's huge scope for public-private partnerships if we can just step into this space a little bit more and think about, well, what can we actually do to bring about some structural change? And it doesn't have to create a cost or a detriment for people who own investment properties or are worried about the value of their house. There are other ways of managing around this issue to enable firstly young people to get into the housing market, but also to provide a safety net, especially for women who, as you say, are the highest risk group of homelessness in the country over 55.
You were getting some good responses in the chat while you were speaking, Zoe, so that was awesome. Let's move on to question 6, which is about the possibility of a Bill of Rights in Australia. This is from a member of the Women for Australia group. It was submitted to me beforehand. I thought it was a really great question, so I'm going to use it tonight. Kim and Georgia, since you've got legal backgrounds, I might direct it at you first, and then Zoe, you can respond if you'd like. Given what's going on in the United States in regards to reproductive justice, bodily autonomy, and the wider global anti-gender movement, are you prepared to actively push for a Bill of Rights, one that enshrines bodily autonomy, access to abortion, and gender-affirming procedures as unassailable rights? We'll start with you, Kim.
So I've been someone who's been out there, excuse me, advocating for a Bill of Rights in a legislative context, so of legislation in the Commonwealth sphere for some time. I think that there are a range of reasons why we need them, need a Bill of Rights. And we've seen, of course, rights statutes in the ACT, in Victoria. So, you know, where as a country, as a federal country, we can see that these can be value adds to our democratic system. I think the key aspect is the educative purpose of Bills of Rights, in the sense that it's not only about having a framework of being able to go to court and the sort of the rule of law concept, which is really important in terms of having a court being able to reflect on legislation as a way of balancing the power of the state versus the individual, but also the flow-on effect it has for our public service in its administration of government legislation. And for me, the focus of my interest, even though I am obviously passionate about those personal interests and gender interests, is more from a citizenship point of view. I mean, we've seen just recently, and I've been involved myself in the international context of this, how things that we take for granted, or we had taken for granted as citizens, of rights that you would think are normally citizens' rights, like the right to enter and live in your own country, are not rights that are protected in any constitutional sense. And those sort of basic aspects in a liberal democratic country that we think exist just don't exist in a structural sense in Australia. Now, politically, a government may be forced to act consistently with rights protection and the proper balancing of it, but ultimately it's not required to, and in the current system, and I don't think that is healthy in a democratic framework. So I think a legislative Bill of Rights has multiple positive flow-ons for educating all citizens about the balancing and of rights and responsibilities between government and the individuals, improving government administration of laws, but also as that safeguard for protecting fundamental aspects of living in a liberal democratic society. And we've just seen with the overreach of government in so many ways that we are in desperate need of that.
And is that something that you will advocate for when elected? I'm not going to say if, when you're elected.
I'm certainly keen to be a promoter of that in every aspects of my working life, and including in the Senate, because I just think that this is something that all Australians need as fundamental protection. And I think as independents, we have much more capacity to do that, because parties have been very reluctant in a federal sense to support that, because it means a diminution of their power. But ultimately, that is in order to enhance the quality of our democracy for all Australians.
Thank you. And Georgia?
Yes, Jess, the very easy way to answer your question is yes. I also would heartily support the introduction of a legislative Bill of Rights at the national level. Australia is the only Western democracy in the world that doesn't have a Bill of Rights, whether at a legislative or constitutional level at the federal level. I think Australians, as Kim said, would be quite surprised to learn the rights that they don't currently have.
I was surprised, absolutely.
Yeah, the rights that we have in our constitution currently are very limited. Right to a trial by jury in certain circumstances, right to vote, certain limited rights in relation to religion, and very limited rights in relation to freedom of speech. We don't actually have what you would typically think of as a freedom of speech in Australia. So I think that it's high time that we introduced a Bill of Rights. I also agree that it has far deeper impact, and it can have a far broader ramifications than simply the legal ones. I think that it introduces into international discourse a certain language that we will eventually start taking for granted in a good way, in ways that we don't now. So it will inform the creation of policy. It will inform the types of legislation and how we think about legislation when we pass them in the Parliament. As Kim said, public servants will be forced to consider these issues when they make decisions. And then there will, depending on the style of legislative Bill of Rights, potentially be enforceable remedies for breaches of those human rights. So there are a wide variety of ways in which it can be done, but I just think that it needs to be done. And I would definitely work towards that. Very much so. The only other thing I would say is that I would worry that we could get bogged down in relation to this issue in the same way that we got bogged down in relation to the Republic debate right at the end of the last century. And it's very easy to make people fearful of changes of this kind, even though we're not necessarily talking about constitutional change. But I think that the introduction of it is necessary and beyond time.
Yeah, I'm a bit conscious of time. Zoe, did you want to respond, or are you happy for me to go on to the next question?
It's fine, Jess. Move on if you're short of time.
Because I am conscious of getting to our questions from our attendees tonight. Our final pre-arranged question for tonight is about women's safety. The so-called women's budget talked a big game about improving women's safety, both physically as well as online, by increasing funding to domestic and family violence and judicial services, implementing only some of Kate Jenkins' Respect at Work recommendations, improving women's workplace participation through changes to childcare, among other things. Now, childcare is not a women's issue, by the way, and you heard it here first. But my question to the panel is, have these measures been adequate? And if not, what else needs to be done to properly address women's safety? And I'll start with, Joe's gone, so I'll start with you, Zoe.
Yeah, well, my position is pretty simple on the Jenkins reports. Both reports need to be implemented in full, no cherry picking. They're integrated solutions, and the government committed to implementing the first Jenkins report and then sat on it for 12 months or so and only implemented certain aspects of it, having been, in my view, dragged kicking and screaming to it, which is emblematic of the reactive nature of this government on a number of issues. To implement the recommendations of Kate Jenkins' report without implementing the main one, which was in effect to get workplaces to take responsibility for sexual harassment without women having to take responsibility for reporting it, is pretty fundamental. And I think any woman who's been sexually harassed would understand that a lot of women don't have the agency or the power to make that report. So that's pretty simple. The latter Kate Jenkins report, she also said herself that it was a fully integrated set of recommendations and that they needed to be implemented in full. I think some of those bigger picture issues we've already covered, but my position really is when you talk about revaluing the care economy and all those other sorts of structural issues around care and childcare and all those sorts of things, that's to do with respect for women and women's place in society and enabling women to participate to their full potential. And as a mother of a 13-year-old daughter, obviously I aspire for her to be able to participate to her full potential, but also not have to grapple with things like her safety in the workplace. So unfortunately, there are some pretty basic things that we're still addressing as we head into a 2022 parliament, including having to march in the streets for basic human rights. And I think the majority of women in Australia are starting to get pretty fed up with it.
Absolutely. I know I am. And I have two daughters, so I've had a real fire lit under me this year for that reason. Georgia, your response.
Yes, I agree with Zoe. There isn't very much more that I would add. I think that women's safety needs to be addressed as a matter of absolute urgency. I think what the government has done so far is inadequate. In the usual way with this government, there have been a lot of announcements. There was money set aside in the budget, but I don't know about you guys, but I don't see any impact of that. I really don't know what's changed. And I think that an enormous amount more work needs to be done. More money needs to be spent. Better programs need to be designed, and they need to be implemented. There's just too much announcing, too much kind of pushing figures around on a page, and not enough actual action. So I don't actually trust the current government to properly implement the measures that they've said they're going to. We haven't seen anything in the way of improvement. And I think that Australian women have been demanding it all year, and I hope that they're going to demand it with their vote at the next election.
Me too. Kim?
Look, a central insight which has really profoundly influenced me to be sitting here as a candidate as opposed to being someone continuing in the policy sphere in this discussion is that through both of those reports, and indeed all of the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's report, she's highlighted that in workplaces where there are equal numbers of women and real equality in leadership, you see a greater culture and protection of women's and men's safety. And it really struck me when the High Court scenario arose, when Justice Dyson Hayden's sexual harassment issue came up. At the time that occurred, we looked at the composition of the High Court, when there had been some reporting and nothing had been done, we saw a court where there were men and women. But in fact, women who were taken seriously and the steps that were taken were in a context where there was a woman Chief Justice and 2 other women. So 3 out of the 7. We're not quite at 4 out of 7 on the High Court. I think we'll get there. But I think that was a profound reflection on the fact that when you have women equally in power, these things are taken seriously. It's because we have the lived experience and that we have an appreciation of how fundamental this is to all human beings, not just women. And for bullying is also in the workplace. So that's been part of my belief that we need more women committed to change in Parliament in those central decision-making positions, because that will flow on into society in terms of our expectations of a norm of women's equal role in society, which I think will then have a flow-on effect. There are other things obviously that need to be done, but it's just such a profound insight that it has really motivated me to say we need, and it's how inspiring it is to be sitting in a panel like this with each of us with such real contributions to make to change things that will, I believe, have an impact on women's safety in society.
Well, I'm feeling cautiously optimistic after tonight, so thank you. We've got about sort of just 10 minutes. We did start a little bit late, so we could go a few minutes over if everyone's okay with that, just a few minutes past 7:30, or sorry, 8:30 by your time. I'll at least do 2 questions from the Q&A section of our panel tonight from our attendees. The first question I wanted to ask you, and look, you can just let me know if you want to respond. Question 1 is, what are your positions on welfare payments, particularly the cashless debit or in-due card? Who would like to respond to that one? Zoe.
Yeah, I'm not in favour of the in-due card unless a community specifically wants it and argues for it. I think there are particular communities with particular issues that are seeing the benefits of it and might want to have it and keep it. The trials that are underway, I think, would need to be underpinned by some really empirical evidence to be extended. I note that several high-profile organisations have said that they don't see the benefit of a cashless debit card for most people, that it takes away people's dignity, that it takes away people's liberty, that it's very disempowering for people. And so from that perspective, I mean, I would have to take the temperature of the electorate in Goldstein, but I think based on the feedback that there has been about the in-due card, it's not something that I would support in its current form, unless we saw some very specific evidence that was convincing to say that it was going to be effective for the broader community. As to extending that to the age pension, which I know has been something that's been considered, I don't consider the age pension a welfare payment. So no, I don't think it's even in the category that should be considered when it comes to the in-due card.
Fantastic. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Kim or Georgia? Georgia?
I'll just respond. This might be considered quite an emotional response, but I think that the in-due card and other measures that seek to limit people's access to welfare payments, or seek to make harder their access to what people need when they're going through really difficult times, is just cruel. I don't understand how it can be the case that cruelty and continually taking things away from people when they're at the most difficult times in their lives is any kind of way to help them get back on track. I think that we need to bring more compassion into a lot of these systems, and I think they need a significant revisiting. And I just think the Indue card, I think it completely takes away people's autonomy. It takes away their dignity, as Zoe said. And I don't think that it is a recipe for the turnaround that governments obviously want, and which are beneficial for the people and for society as a whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Your final question for tonight, it's very important. I mean, if we don't have a hospitable planet, we can't fight for equal rights for all genders. So what will you do to advocate for the fight climate change is one of our questions from our attendees tonight. Who would like to respond first?
Well, I can start off in the sense that, again, one of the motivators for me to be running is looking at the ineffective approach of our federal government to climate change action as being emblematic of the real breakdown in our party political system. It's just so undeniable that this is such a pressing issue and that things can be done. Look at our state governments who are doing things. Look at business that is doing things. So it's not that it's impossible. We know that it is really possible. It's just that our party system at the moment has been the break on real engagement with evidence-based approaches to acting in a way that will protect our planet for the future. So I just think it is so fundamental if people who are committed to engaging with that evidence, who are committed to not just labelling the other side as the other that you're not prepared to talk to engage with a civilised, respectful and authentic commitment to getting good climate change action, will be able to do it.
Absolutely. Zoe or Georgia, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so I would just say that climate change has been weaponised as a moral issue in this country for more than a decade, and we've wasted a lot of time. It's still a moral issue, but it's also now an economic issue. We have no choice but to act. And as Kim said, business community are running way ahead of government on this. Internationally, we are at the bottom of several lists. We have a huge opportunity with the resources that we have available to us: sun, wind, open space, huge human capital, huge financial capital. We can be a leader in this space, and that's the future of our children, not just environmentally, but also economically, and our prosperity is at stake. There's no time to wait. The next 3 years will be absolutely pivotal on this issue. So that really actually is at the crux of, I think, the way that a lot of people will vote at the next election. And it goes to, I think, what is the overarching issue politically right now, and that is accountability. This government is not accountable on climate policy, and who will be accountable down the track when the horse has bolted and we can't put it back into the stable.
I'm noticing that a lot of LNP sitting MPs have been doing a lot of photos next to solar panels recently. Georgia, your last word?
In addition to what Kim and Zoe have said, I'll just say that I am loudly optimistic, actually, that we're going to have a few more members on the crossbench after the next election. And I think that as a result of that, the action that we need to take on climate change will happen. And I think from there, it's all systems go. There are so many opportunities. Zoe laid them out, and we can do it quickly, we can do it effectively, and we can quickly be a world leader. So let's just get going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to wrap up. We're going to leave it there tonight. On behalf of Women for Australia and all the attendees tonight, I would like to sincerely thank our panelists, Professor Kim Rubenstein, Zoe Daniel, Georgia Steele, and Jo Dyer, even though she's left, for taking the time to answer our questions tonight. I wish you all the very best for the campaign. We'll be watching really, really closely. We'd be happy to have you back at any time to platform for you in the lead up to the election, because I've had such fun. Also, very special thanks to my Women for Australia mods team, particularly to Steph and Liz, who are on the chat tonight and running the tech. I'm not very technical, so the fact that we're here and we're talking to each other is miraculous. So thank you. Thanks also to Leah, who did the promotional graphics for this event. I have the best mods team in the world and I just couldn't do it without them, so thank you. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you who are in attendance tonight. Please consider supporting the Women for Australia fundraiser at www.womenforaustralia.com.au. You will help us to support candidates with strong plans for gender equality and enable us to continue to create content and platform for the issues that we care about. If you are feeling powerless, angry, or disillusioned with the state of politics in Australia, I implore you to get involved. So much of what has been allowed to fester in the halls of power, particularly in recent years, has capitalised on political disengagement. Get engaged and do it now. Join an organisation, join a political party, volunteer for a candidate that you care about. Talk to your family or friends. It is not impolite to talk about politics. You must. Donate money or donate your time to something that you care about. Write letters, start a podcast, because someone has to do something, right? Well, you are someone, so find your community. We will be hosting events in the lead up to the election. If you want to talk to us about a possible event, email us at contact@womenforaustralia.com.au. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, we are Women for Fairness. We are Women for Equality. We are Women for Community. We are Women for Australia. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Jess.
Thank you, Jess.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Good
Zoe.
night. Thanks,
Georgia.
Good
everyone.
night.